Brutal history, the Great Molasses Flood of 1919. On a cold January afternoon in 1919, the people of Boston heard what sounded like machine gun fire. A thunderous crack split the air, buildings trembled, and before anyone could react, a tidal wave, thick, black, and 25 feet high, came roaring through the streets. It wasn't water, it wasn't fire, it was molasses, a wall of sticky, suffocating syrup, moving faster than a man could run, swallowing everything in its path. Horses, wagons, entire families swept away in a flood so bizarre, so brutal, that survivors would describe it as the closest thing to drowning in glue. This was no accident of nature, this was no freak act of God, it was a man-made disaster born of greed, corruption, and arrogance. And the horror it unleashed turned a sweet kitchen staple into an unstoppable weapon of death. The story begins with a tank, an enormous steel tank looming over Boston's North End. It was 50 feet tall, 90 feet wide, and capable of holding more than 2 million gallons of molasses. The tank belonged to the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, which had been rushing to capitalize on the booming demand for alcohol. With prohibition on the horizon, companies were scrambling to stockpile raw materials. Molasses could be fermented into industrial alcohol, then distilled into liquor or used for munitions. To the company, it was liquid gold. But the tank was a time bomb. From the day it was built in 1915, residents noticed it groaned and leaked. Children would scoop up sticky drips from its sides with tin cups. Locals complained of rivets that rattled and seams that seeped. Workers reported hearing ominous creaks echoing through its walls. The company's response? They painted the tank brown to hide the leaks. Still, it stood there, an enormous looming giant over one of Boston's busiest immigrant neighborhoods. Towering above houses, a fire station, and even a playground, nobody could have guessed how close it was to catastrophe. On January 15, 1919, the air was unusually warm. Temperatures had risen suddenly from freezing cold to nearly 40 degrees. Inside the tank, the molasses, thick, heavy, and unstable, expanded under the heat. At 12:30 p.m., with almost no warning, the tank exploded. Witnesses described the sound as a deep roar, followed by sharp cracks like gunfire as rivets shot through the air like bullets. The entire tank split apart, releasing its contents in an instant. A wave of molasses 25 feet high and 160 feet wide surged into the streets at nearly 35 miles per hour. It was fast enough to crush buildings, strong enough to hurl trucks, and heavy enough to snap the steel supports of Boston's elevated railway. The wave hit with unimaginable force. A 2-ton truck was thrown into Boston Harbor, a firehouse was ripped off its foundation, wooden houses splintered like matchsticks. Horses, the lifeblood of the city's transport, were swallowed whole, their desperate cries muffled under the syrup. People ran, but molasses is deceptive. It moves slowly when poured from a bottle. But when millions of gallons are unleashed at once, its sheer mass makes it unstoppable. Those who tried to outrun it were overtaken, dragged under, and trapped. Survivors later said it was like being caught in quicksand. Once the molasses touched you, escape was nearly impossible. Clothing glued to skin, limbs stuck fast, lungs filled with sticky fumes. People who fell into the flood often never got back up. One man recalled watching helplessly as his friend sank deeper and deeper into the syrup, suffocating before his eyes. Within minutes, the North End was unrecognizable. The streets were buried under a sea of molasses 2 to 3 feet deep. Rescuers waded through the muck, but every step was agony. Horses flailed, firefighters pulled, children screamed from beneath debris. The more rescuers struggled, the more the syrup clung, holding them like a giant fly trap. The death toll was staggering. 21 people were killed. More than 150 were injured. Bodies were found days later, trapped under rubble, preserved in the sticky sludge. Entire families were wiped out. The smell of molasses lingered in the air for weeks and in some places for decades. But the horror didn't end when the floodwaters, or rather, the flood syrup, receded. The cleanup was a nightmare unlike anything the city had ever faced. Hundreds of workers with shovels, brooms and hoses struggled to clear the thick, clinging mess. Salt water from fireboats was pumped in from the harbor, but the molasses simply spread, coating everything it touched. Workers grew sick from the fumes. Horses had to be shot where they stood, trapped in hardened syrup. And as the sticky sludge was dragged away, it spread beyond Boston. Workers tracked it through the streets, into subway cars, onto trolley seats. For months afterward, the city reeked of molasses. For years, residents swore they could still smell it on hot days. Even decades later, old-timers claimed the streets never truly lost the stench. But what made the disaster truly brutal wasn't just the destruction, it was the cause. The tank had been a disaster waiting to happen, and the company knew it. Construction had been rushed, corners cut, inspections ignored. The steel used for the tank walls was far too thin, and tests later revealed it lacked essential ingredients like manganese, making it brittle and prone to cracking. Engineers warned it was unsafe. Neighbors complained about leaks. Even the company's own workers raised alarms, but management dismissed every warning, driven by greed and the need to get molasses to market before prohibition cut into profits. When survivors sued, the company's defense was chilling. They claimed the disaster was caused not by negligence, but by anarchists. In the wake of World War I, fear of anarchist bombings was widespread. The company argued that radicals had sabotaged the tank. But the evidence was overwhelming. Metallurgical studies showed the steel plates were too thin, the rivets were poorly fitted. The tank had never been properly tested. This wasn't sabotage, it was corporate recklessness on a colossal scale. The lawsuits became the largest civil case in Massachusetts history at the time. Testimonies dragged on for years. Engineers, laborers, and survivors all described the ominous groans and leaks long before the explosion. Ultimately, the court ruled that the United States Industrial Alcohol Company was responsible. They paid out nearly $1 million in damages, a fortune then, equivalent to tens of millions today. But no executive went to prison. No one faced criminal charges. For the families who had lost everything, justice was partial at best. The Great Molasses Flood became legend, a story so bizarre it bordered on unbelievable. Newspapers around the country mocked it with headlines like "a sticky mess." Cartoons depicted people drowning in syrup as if it were slapstick comedy. But for those who lived through it, there was nothing funny. It was terror, chaos, and death delivered in the unlikeliest form imaginable. And its lessons echoed far beyond Boston. The disaster led to stricter building codes, mandatory engineering oversight, and recognition that corporate negligence could be as deadly as any weapon. In a sense, the flood was one of the events that pushed America toward modern safety regulations, rules written in molasses and blood. Even today, more than a century later, the story of the Great Molasses Flood lingers. The site where the tank once stood is now a park, but old residents claim that on hot summer days, you can still catch a faint, sickly sweet smell of molasses rising from the ground, a ghostly reminder of the day when sweetness turned to death and the streets of Boston ran not with water, but with syrup. The question that hangs in the air is simple. How could such a disaster happen? How could executives ignore every warning sign, every leak, every groan of steel, until catastrophe was inevitable? The answer is one we've seen throughout history. Profit came first, safety came second, human life came last. The Great Molasses Flood wasn't just a freak accident, it was the product of greed, arrogance, and willful neglect. And that is why it deserves its place in brutal history.